So the creator of Tiger King and Chimp Crazy is back at it again, but this time he's looking to expose the reptile people. Now, some of you may be aware that the creator of Tiger King and Chimp Crazy, Eric Goode, was actually working on a reptile trafficking themed docuseries before Tiger King. The opening scene of Tiger King starts at Tom Crutchfield's house. Tom is a very prominent member of the reptile community. We'll talk about a lot about him later on, but there's a scene of them carrying out this giant reticulated python from a barn. Eric is filming his reptile-themed series at that time, but then suddenly gets sidetracked by a random snow leopard that happens to be in someone's van, and that's what sent him down the big cat path, hence Tiger King. Now, Eric has publicly said several times that he's back to working on the reptile trafficking docuseries.
We're doing our next doc series is about reptiles and the smuggling of reptiles. We have a whole section on that.
It's another thing I want to
So that's what we're going to discuss here today. From now on, for the remainder of this video, I'm just going to refer to this docuseries as the Reptile King. I have no idea what it's going to be called, but just for the sake of simplicity, let's call it Reptile King for today. Now, in my opinion, I believe that this docuseries is going to be even more compelling than both Tiger King and Chimp Crazy. And if you're a non-reptile person and you think the characters and the people who are in Tiger King and Chimp Crazy were bizarre and strange, then buckle up.
Guess what?
I believe the reptile community takes that to another level, and they also take the criminality to another level as well. Obviously, there's layers of criminality within both Tiger King and Chimp Crazy, but as you're about to see in this video, the reptile people have a tendency to take it one step further. Now, here's what I think this docuseries is going to show. I believe we're going to see animals being smuggled. That goes without saying. Animals kept in poor conditions, animals dying. I think we will also see well-respected and well-known zoological facilities like your favorite zoos that are going to be shown to be complicit in wildlife trafficking. I think viewers will be left with the feeling that the people in the show have a general lack of respect for life. And I also believe that we're not only going to see wildlife crime, but we're also going to take it to, full-blown crime that you would think of when you think of somebody being a criminal. Now, I believe that the implications of this docuseries is not going to be good for the reptile community. I think it will have a similar effect that both the Big Cat Public Safety Act has had on the cat keeping community, we'll call it, as well as the Captive Primate Safety Act, which has not been passed yet, but that's something that will probably be passed, I'm sure, again, having large implications on those communities. Now, I actually agree with those two acts, so we'll talk about why I may or may not be a hypocrite in a second, but I believe that people who watch this docuseries are going to leave with the idea that keeping reptiles as pets is not a good idea, and that anybody who does so is probably going to be painted with a similar brush of the folks that you see in the series. So in today's video, I want to take a look at who exactly is Eric Goode. I want to take a look at who are more than likely to be the characters in this Reptile King docuseries. I want to give you a brief overview of wildlife trafficking, why people do it, how they get away with it, the punishment that happens when they get caught. Now, finally, I'm going to end the video with a plea, especially to the non-reptile keeping public, to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what I mean by that is this docuseries is surely going to highlight some really abhorrent behaviors. Anybody in the ethical keeping community would agree with you that these are some bad things that we don't want to see happening. But I really hope that we can end up in a place where I can show you some value that the reptile community that provides the society in general. And that might sound like a stretch if you're not a reptile keeping person, but please stick around to the end so you can see my testimony as to why I believe there is still a lot of value within the reptile keeping community. You may leave this video just thinking he is a total hypocrite now that they're coming after his community. He wants to make a video getting in front of it. You can think that as well. But in order for us to cover all these topics, we need to go deep. So hopefully you are ready for that. Okay, so who is Eric Goode? Well, Eric Goode is a wealthy American entrepreneur, businessman. Well before Tiger King and Chimp Crazy, Eric was building or opening restaurants, bars, and hotels. And that's where he made a lot of his money. In the 80s, he opened up his first club called Area Nightclub with his brother. And that was a hit. And I think that after that, he just kind of kept the ball rolling and continuing to open new establishments along the way. He's a reptile lover and a keeper. Even from a young age, you can find articles of him talking about some of his first pet tortoise that he had when he was a young child at 8 years old or so. And so he's, I think, always had a bit of a soft spot for reptiles. So it's actually hard to tell what Eric's opinion is on people keeping reptiles as pets in general. He did it as a child, but does he still believe it's okay as an adult? I'm not sure. He also opened the Turtle Conservancy, which is a conservancy that works on, I believe, captive breeding of certain animals that are certain species of turtles and tortoises that are endangered, but also protecting land that can protect the species that are wild into those areas. And he actually made the claim that he creates films and creates documentaries and docuseries in order to fund conservation, which I think anybody would agree is a pretty valiant thing to do. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And with the success of Tiger King and Chimp Crazy, I'm sure he's been able to put a lot of money into conservation. However, I think one concern that folks have with the way Eric Goode creates his docuseries is that he tends to embellish the drama, and I think that is actually not something that's unique to Eric. It's unique to Hollywood and TV, but especially in the animal world. I think there's something weird that happens. Animals are not interesting to most people, so in order to make animals interesting, they typically have to add some bizarre animal or human drama on top of the animal story in order to make it interesting for most people. Now, if you're an animal person like you and I, we'd rather just sit down and watch Planet Earth and watch animals act naturally, but that's not really going to hit most of the public, and I will talk about that more in a little bit, but let's just quickly read a snippet from an LA Times article. Goode does not necessarily feel obligated to follow educational or ethical guidelines by which conservationists and journalists abide. Without these indoctrinated boundaries, as he calls them, he has the freedom to find, or in the case of Chimp Crazy, provoke dramatic on-screen conflicts and satisfying resolutions that traditional documentarians might not. Now, what that means is he's okay with maybe not sticking firmly to the truth to make a story that's going to have people binging on Netflix. I can't really hold that against him, but also it does raise me some concerns when he's now coming into the community that I'm a part of. It does make you wonder what sort of stories might he fabricate to make the story more interesting to the non-reptile person. So that's a brief summary of Eric Goode. Again, there's absolutely no doubt that he is working on a reptile trafficking documentary. I also assume that it's going to branch out into more areas.
Sort of a big part of our next documentary, which is about the illegal animal trade, but also zoos were complicit in that for a very long time, maybe still. So anyway, sort of going
So let's discuss who might be in this documentary. And now there's a really great clip from the Reptiles With podcast. Shout out to those guys. They're an amazing group of guys over there. They had Chandler from Chandler's Wildlife on their podcast to discuss this. Now, Chandler is an interesting person. He has a very large YouTube channel. He's kind of one of the large animal personality creators on YouTube. And he lives in Florida, which is sort of the epicenter of the story that we're going to be telling here today. And here's what he had to say.
Eric Goode is the director. He produced Tiger King. And Tiger King started with the reptile documentary. So there is a reptile documentary that will come out with Tom Crutchfield, Joe Wasilewski, Tyler Nolan, my friend's going to be in it. A bunch of people are going to be in it from the reptile world. And it's really not going to look good because his angle is to show all the outrageous stuff. And I think that documentary is actually focusing on smuggling and different aspects of keeping crazy reptiles.
So we're going to look into some of these folks that Chandler has mentioned there. I find it interesting that he actually doesn't want to be a part of it, yet his friends are going to be a part of the documentary, and he's simultaneously saying it will not look good on the hobby. So that's kind of an interesting point he's making there. This will undoubtedly show animal trafficking, illegal animal trafficking, I guess that's a redundant thing to say, for both the private and the public sector. And I think that's going to shock some people for sure. People quite often see the zoos as this pristine area of science and conservation, but at the end of the day, there's competition and egos involved, and I think what we're about to find out is many people are not above breaking the law. Now, Tom Crutchfield is certainly going to be one of the, if not the central figure of this docuseries. He's been around forever. He is a two-time convicted reptile smuggler. He's been working with reptiles his whole life, and he simultaneously is still a very well-respected member of the reptile community. I'll explain how that's possible in a little bit, but before I tell you a little bit more about Tom Crutchfield, I want to spend some time discussing reptile smuggling and why reptile smuggling is really a no-brainer for those who are willing to sort of bend the rule of law. Now, I don't want to get sucked into the weeds with the legal stuff here on the wildlife trafficking front, but to understand wildlife trafficking, you at least need to have a vague understanding of two pieces of legislation, the Lacey Act and CITES. So the Lacey Act is a piece of American legislation that actually dates all the way back to 1900, and it's simply a conservation law in the United States that prohibits trade in wildlife, fish, and plants that have been illegally taken, possessed, transported, or sold. But the interesting thing about the Lacey Act is it allows the U.S. government to enforce conservation laws from other countries on American soil. For example, let's say a species is not considered illegal in the United States, but is considered illegal in another country. The Lacey Act allows government officials to prosecute people for working with those species or transporting those species, even though they aren't breaking technically an American law. Maybe they're not breaking the Endangered Species Act, but they are breaking the law of, let's say, Japan, for example. So it does give the U.S. government quite a lot of power when it comes to conservation. Now, the second piece of legislation that you need to understand is CITES. Now, CITES is the Convention of the International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And it's simply an agreement that many governments have signed on to help reduce wildlife trafficking and protect endangered species. So if you have been charged with wildlife trafficking in the United States, you've likely violated either LACI, CITES, or both, or even the Endangered Species Act, which is another piece of legislation that we won't get into today. And wildlife trafficking is a felony. So if you do get charged with wildlife trafficking, it's not a small slap on the wrist misdemeanor, especially not anymore in the 2020s. It used to be something that you could get away with a lot easier, but now the government does have quite a lot of power to prosecute people for breaking these rules. So that leaves us with the question, why would somebody want to break these rules? What would drive somebody to get into smuggling animals in the first place? Now, this could be me just oversimplifying things because I tend to like to put things into categories, but in my own head, I see two different categories of animal smugglers. Now, my category 1 smuggler is somebody who is just in it strictly for business. All they're concerned about is making money. They don't have any respect for the life of the animal that they're shoving into a suitcase, and it is just a transaction for them. Buy it for a low price, sell it for a high price, move on, do it again. Now, category 2 is a lot more nuanced. This is somebody who actually has a deep passion for the animals, but they choose to participate in smuggling anyway. Now, if you're a non-reptile person or a non-animal person, you might be thinking, how is that possible? How could you be passionate about an animal, but then also pull them from their wild environment and shove them into a suitcase and bring them home into captivity? That doesn't make sense. Well, let me paint this picture for you.
In Asia, you had this twofold problem where, first of all, you had a wet market. So the wet market was the one that would decimate local species of turtles and tortoises, because most likely than not, your average person isn't interested in keeping local species. The wet market supplies food and diet of the country. So in a lot of these Asian countries, yellow temple turtles and Asian box turtles were kind of eaten a lot. So I remember walking in as a kid in these markets that were not pet markets, right? So they're simply wet markets selling seafood and all that. So you see buckets of turtles, like you're talking no crawl space with a net on top full of temple turtles. You'd go to the other one full of box
So imagine
turtles.
That's you standing in that market. You are a turtle person. You're passionate about turtles and tortoises, and you love working with them, and you're also very concerned about their wild populations plummeting into almost the abyss. You're walking through this market, and you see a species of turtle that is critically endangered stacked up in a bucket that are going to be eaten. Now, this is not to pass judgment on the local cuisine or what people eat in those cultures, but just simply looking at those turtles in a bucket, knowing that they're going to be eaten and knowing that their wild populations are being decimated, that would tear at your heartstrings. And you just think to yourself, all I have to do is buy a few of these turtles. They're incredibly inexpensive. I can shove them in a couple socks, put them into a suitcase, and fly them home. And then I can introduce them into a nice, clean facility where I can work with them, I can breed them, and at least preserve that species on the planet should they go completely extinct in the wild. That's the sort of thinking that a very passionate animal person could actually find themselves smuggling an animal, breaking the law, but simultaneously saving the animal at the same time. You could also think of it this way. Imagine there's a nice section of wild habitat in your local area, and you are not allowed to take animals from that area and bring them into your own home. Many places have legislation where you're not allowed to keep native species. But the next week, bulldozers can come by and plow down that section of wild habitat, whatever it is, and build a shopping center, and all the animals in that area would be killed. But a week ago, you wouldn't be allowed to take one of those animals home and keep them in your home and maybe raise them and breed them and continue to perpetuate them. There's a little bit of, I don't know what to call it. It's at least inconsistent for sure. And if you're somebody who's an animal person, or maybe you're not an animal person, I think you could at least put yourself in their shoes to understand why somebody would break a law in order to save an animal. And also, I think it might be interesting, especially for the non-reptile people watching this video, why somebody would choose to smuggle reptiles specifically rather than some other type of animal. Well, reptiles have some pretty unique characteristics that really make them perfect for smuggling. Of course, this is not an endorsement to smuggle, but I just want to talk about the facts. Most of them are incredibly robust. They can handle an amazing amount of, or I should say an amazing lack of care. They can go long time, quite often days, weeks, months without eating, days, weeks without water. And they are cold-blooded, which means when you cool them down, their movement will be reduced. You could just imagine that. Imagine you filled it, not a great image, but imagine you filled a sock of a few mice, live mice. It doesn't matter what you do with them. They're going to be scurrying around, making a racket, moving around in that suitcase or however you plan on smuggling. Again, this is not an endorsement for smuggling, but you could put reptiles in that same sock, and the cooler temperatures is going to reduce their movement almost to immobilize them in a way. So you could have somebody open the suitcase and they're not going to see things scurrying around. They can also be very difficult to identify. Unless you're somebody who's very in the reptile world, you're not going to be able to easily tell the difference between certain species. And if you're just the average wildlife agent or border security, you may not know what you're looking at. And some species of reptiles also tend to have a massive profit margin because people are going into the wild and collecting large samples and selling them for exorbitant amounts. And this is partly the reason why the wildlife trafficking trade and the drug trafficking trade overlap. In many ways, the profit margin is just as good on the wildlife side. I know this almost sounds like I'm promoting trafficking, but I'm not. I'm just giving you the facts. They have the same profit margins as drugs do without the risk necessarily. I mean, it would be pretty obvious if someone opened up your suitcase and they saw a bunch of white powder in bricks. But if they open up a suitcase and find a snake that they're not sure to identify, I mean, you're much more likely to be in trouble with a suitcase full of drugs than a suitcase full of lizards. And I want to share with you two stories that just prove how much these two illegal worlds overlap. Both these stories I got from Brian Christie's book, The Lizard King. I highly recommend checking it out. I'll put a link in the description. He mentioned these stories in the book, and I want to show them to you now. Now, both these stories come out of Miami. Absolutely no surprise there. The first one comes from the 90s, and you have to remember in the 80s and the 90s, the wildlife trafficking side to the punishment, the prosecution of wildlife traffickers was not very potent, and it's gotten a lot better now. Again, we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But this first story shows 312 boas that were found with cocaine shoved up their cloaca, which means they took, I guess, condoms or something. I think it was condoms, and shoved them into the boa's bum, essentially, for those that don't know what a cloaca is, and that was their way of trafficking drugs across the border. Now, unfortunately, the wildlife agents were attempting to do a controlled drop, meaning they're going to watch this person, the person who brought them over, drop them at the site to make this so-called drug deal, and clearly the people picked up on it and they left the boas in a warm van, and of course they all died. Now, that's a horrible story, but again, that's just showing the overlap of the reptile world and the drug world. And finally, there's this story again out of Miami, and this story is from 2004. It's actually a pretty clever plan. Again, I'm not condoning this behavior. I feel like I'm starting to make an advertise for criminality here, but I'm just telling you the facts. This is a shipment of fish that came in across the border. As you can imagine, fish come in large clear plastic bags of water with the fish inside them, but these specific bags had the conventional plastic bag with water, but also bags on top of those bags with more liquid in between. So essentially you have a bag, a liquid, another bag, and then fish, a bag of fish and water. And in the between layer was liquid cocaine. So that's how they were bringing cocaine across the border. Again, very clever, but it was caught, thankfully, and that just goes to show you how intertwined these worlds are of wildlife trafficking and drug trafficking. Anyway, let's get back to who I believe will be the main character of this Reptile King docuseries, and that is Tom Crutchfield. Tom is a native Floridian. He's been an animal lover his entire life. I've had him on my podcast. So he talked to me about how he, finding snakes as a young child, and that's what got him into keeping reptiles and just being fascinated with the wildlife in general.
Back as I can remember, the very first recollection I have of reptiles in me was turning over a rock in my yard and finding a ringneck snake. And that was life-changing for me, because that was, I think, probably one of the most interesting snakes or things at the time I had ever seen, and I knew it wasn't venomous because I already knew the venomous snakes that occurred where I lived, but I wasn't sure what kind of snake it is. And of course, I looked it up. I was about 6 years old.
He eventually got a job in a department store selling carpets, I believe. And, that led to the normal unhappy with this job, I'm not enjoying myself, and quickly found the world of reptile smuggling. Again, he was a reptile keeper at the time, and it was a pretty easy fit for him. He started very small, flying to foreign countries, putting a few things in a suitcase, bringing them across. As he told me,
they don't care. They just don't care.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody cared. They didn't even want to be bothered. The one guy here in Miami that worked for Fish and Wildlife Service in the 70s was named John Thomas. And I brought the reptiles probably 10 times when he was the officer, when he was called. And he let them through every time, and he never looked at anything. He never even came down there. He didn't even want to come down there. Nobody knew what a CITES permit even was until really in the late 1970s to early 80s. I mean, I think we signed on as a signatory for CITES in 1967.
Right.
So it was that late just signing, but the laws and everything weren't even in place for a good 10 more years or so in terms of being able to enforce them. And then they didn't really enforce them because they didn't know how to exactly.
So it's hard to tell if he actually thought what he was doing was wrong or just because nobody was really enforcing it, he was just fine with doing it. And of all things of that nature, it continued to grow and mushroom and become bigger and more illegal. And for all the stories that are related to Tom, definitely check out the book Stolen World by Jenny Aaron Smith. It's fascinating. I'll get into way more detail than I'm going to get into today, but a lot of the things that I learned in that book, I'm going to quickly share with you here as well. So at one point, Tom was actually doing over $1 million of sales a year, bringing in reptiles from other countries. He eventually stopped doing the actual trafficking himself and was just sort of accepting shipments from all across the world, some legal and some not. You know, he would use the normal tricks of any person that's trying to skirt the law. Hey, this lizard is illegal for you to buy, so I'm going to give it to you, and then you're going to donate me some money, or I'm going to sell you this bag of chips for $8,000 and we'll call it a day. Tom was associates with Anson Wong, who is a notorious animal trafficker out of Malaysia. Both of them did tons of business together, and a lot of this is predicated on false paperwork. You know, you have a corrupt bureaucrat in some government office in a tropical country that's willing to just create paperwork out of thin air saying that a box of animals that's actually wild caught is captive bred, allowing them to be brought into the country. Things like that happen all the time. Anson Wong obviously was eventually prosecuted for his crimes. But what makes this even more fascinating is the amount of stories that Tom has, and this is the type of thing that I imagine we're going to see in this Reptile King docuseries, is how much business Tom and others like him did with accredited, well-known, well-respected zoos. Zoos would buy animals from Tom and actually force him to sign a little contract that basically said, these animals are not acquired in any violation of any U.S. or foreign wildlife laws, and I hereby indemnify and protect the purchaser of any legal claim or evidence which proves the illegal origin of these animals. So essentially, it's just a CYA, cover your ass policy that the zoos had in order to acquire animals that they really wanted in their collection, but simultaneously most likely knew that they were coming from illegal sources, but were able to kind of turn a blind eye to that scenario. Now, I believe that's the sort of stuff that this docuseries is going to highlight. Now, obviously, if you are dealing in illegal activities, it is only a matter of time before you get busted, and Tom's first conviction came in 1995 when he pled guilty for smuggling Fijian banded iguanas, and he spent 5 months in prison. Now, of course, serving 5 months in prison did not change Tom's behavior, and he was also arrested in 1999 under Operation Chameleon, which was a large animal trafficking undercover operation to bust people like Anson Wong and Tom Crutchfield. You can actually watch season 7 of episode 2 of Locked Up Abroad, which is a National Geographic show, and Tom talks about his experience getting arrested. He actually fled the country to Belize and ended up spending, I think, 4 or 5 months in an open-air, horrible, dangerous prison because he didn't want to come back to the United States to basically serve his sentence or to be arrested and charged for more animal trafficking. But eventually, the government in Belize did extradite him back to the United States, where he was charged again with animal trafficking, this time sentenced to 30 months in prison. So not only does Tom Shirley have crazy stories about reptile smuggling that he has yet to talk about in public, I mean, maybe there's some sort of statute of limitations that's passed that allows him to talk about it without getting in trouble. There's also been some Tiger King-esque things that have happened on his property. For example, his business partner barricaded himself in one of the buildings back in 2011 and died of a shooting. I think it was suicide, but those are the type of things that will be investigated, I'm sure, on this series. Tom is the perfect person for this if you are attempting to make something that has a high level of entertaining value. Again, how far and how close we will be to the truth, we don't know. I wanted to spend a little bit of time just discussing some of the other characters that Tom would have been doing business with back in the 80s and the 90s. This is the type of stories that will make for a crazy, entertaining docuseries. And again, it's not going to make the reptile people look good, or even people who keep now good, but there are certainly things that Tom will talk about because of how absolutely insane and mind-blowing they are. Now, we're about to talk about some legitimate, heinous criminal activity, and I want to make clear I'm absolutely not connecting Tom with these stories at all, but these are the people he absolutely rubbed shoulders with and did business with back in the 80s and the 90s. So I want to introduce you to Ray Van Ostrin. Now, if you want more information on this story, make sure you go read Lizard King by Brian Christie. It's an incredible book. Fascinating. This is where I got most of this information. Ray is an animal lover, or was an animal lover. He grew up in New York. Again, somebody that from day one was interested in animals. He quickly became a pet store owner in Brooklyn, I believe, but he immediately starts participating in behavior that makes you question whether or not he is a true animal lover. For example, he would mix his parrot seed with anise oil, which is apparently very addictive to parrots for some reason, and that would force the customers to always have to come back to his store to buy that particular food. They could never branch out anywhere else. He would release budgies into the park that he couldn't sell, whether they were maybe deformed or just something about them was unsellable. He would release them into the park, and then unknowingly people would find these birds and come to the pet store and buy the equipment needed to raise that bird. He eventually moved down to Florida and participated in the poaching of the eastern indigo snake, which if you're a reptile person, you know that it's kind of a revered animal in our hobby. They're an amazing, beautiful snake, endangered, and the idea of poaching them for money really does not, or I should say really rubs people the wrong way. That's the type of stuff that Ray participated in. But this is where the story gets insane. Ray started an import business for exotic wildlife and at one point was literally selling off 200,000 to 300,000 iguanas a year into the pet trade. If you were around in the 90s, you probably knew somebody with a pet iguana, which is really a horrible pet for most people, but Ray was responsible for a lot of that. Now, Ray continued to run his exotic import business and eventually was approached by somebody named Mario Tabraui. I think Mario was looking for tortoises at the time, but the connection here is very important. At the time, Mario Tabraui was the leader of the largest and most violent drug trafficking ring in Miami. And actually, people who knew Mario at that time and then subsequently watched the movie Scarface are absolutely convinced that Al Pacino's character, Tony Montana, is based off of Mario Tabraui. And actually, their initials are exactly the same, just flipped. So all of those crazy stories depicted in Scarface, I'm sure it's embellished because of Hollywood, but that's the sort of thing that Mario was participating in at that time. Now, Ray and Mario started working together, and eventually this led to Ray peddling drugs for Mario as well, and he eventually got busted for drug trafficking. Now, in order for Ray to reduce his drug trafficking sentence, he testified against Mario, which led to Mario's arrest. So the Tabraui organization was, of course, accused with drug trafficking, but also murder. Now, one of the stories told in the trial was that there was a government informant working for Tabraui, working for Mario's men, and when they discovered that this was an undercover government agent, he was killed. This is where it gets disturbing, and Mario allegedly dismembered the body with either a chainsaw or a circular saw. I've seen reports of both, and then subsequently put the informant into some sort of receptacle to be burned. Now, he was not charged with that, but that's what the prosecution raised in the trial. And Mario's wife at the time was also murdered. I believe she was shot 9 or 10 times. And the prosecution again alleged that Mario found out that she was going to go to the government or go to the police force with information about Mario and the organization he was running. And he put a hit on her to have her killed. Now, again, that's allegedly. He was not charged for anything to do with the murders. Both of those things were raised as allegations in the trial, but he was charged on the drug trafficking claims. So Ray was charged with 5 years in prison, and Mario was actually charged with, I think, 80 or more years in prison, but got out after only 10 for informing on somebody else. So you can see that this sort of world just ends up on people informing on each other to reduce their sentences. Now, with Ray in prison, that forced his son Michael to take over the exotic wildlife business that Ray had created. Michael is admittedly not a reptile person. He doesn't like working with reptiles, but he could clearly see the business opportunity that they presented. So he quickly transitioned the company away from obviously drugs and whatnot to something called Strictly Reptiles. Strictly Reptiles is a very well-known reptile importer in the United States, and for a very long time were the largest importer, and I believe they probably still are one of the largest importers in the States of reptiles, both legal and illegal. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, according to the book Stolen World, Tom Crutchfield was doing about $1 million of sales per year at his height. Strictly Reptiles quickly built up to over $8 million per year. They were importing 30 to 40,000 ball pythons a year. They were doing a ton of business. Both Strictly Reptiles and Tom Crutchfield did business together. There's a lot. If you read Lizard King, you'll see that a lot of the animals that Strictly Reptiles was bringing in was on the pretense of false paperwork. So again, you're taking animals that are actually wild caught and endangered, and then having a corrupt bureaucrat creating paperwork that says these animals are captive bred, even though they aren't. And I believe there's a quote from Lizard King, if I'm remembering correctly, that Michael talks about having absolutely zero remorse about bagging animals up and selling them. Again, it's a business transaction. We're talking about the category number 1 of the animal smuggler, someone that's doing this for business alone. Now, eventually in 1997, Michael was also arrested and convicted of animal smuggling. I believe it was frilled dragons at the time, which eventually brought him down. Now, he spent some time in jail, but you know the story. He ratted out somebody else, one of his business associates, and reduced his sentence. Now, that person who he ratted out was someone named Dwayne Cunningham. And the reason I bring up Dwayne is because I think he's also a character that will absolutely be in Eric Goode's docuseries, because he was already one of the main characters in Chimp Crazy. If you watch Chimp Crazy, Dwayne Cunningham acts as the proxy director for Eric Goode during those interactions with Tanya and Tonka and the other chimps, as well as the other individuals in that series. Eric Goode was too well known at that point, so he needed somebody to stand in for him. He chose Dwayne Cunningham because he had a background in wildlife smuggling. Now you know how he got busted. He got busted because Michael Van Nostrum ratted on him when he was in prison. And I think it's also worth noting that Michael has now recently been arrested again in, I think, 2021 for animal smuggling again. Generally, these guys just don't change. So again, Tom Crutchfield, who I believe will be the main character of this docuseries, is a 2-time convicted animal smuggler, but I don't believe him to be an evil person. I also don't even believe him to be in the category 1 of someone who just smuggled for the sake of smuggling as a business transaction. I do believe he actually has some passion for the animals, and even a lot of passion for the animals that he worked with, even the animals he illegally trafficked. If I had to categorize Tom, I'd probably put him at like a 1.5. He's someone that clearly did it for the money, but also has a passion for the animals. And that's actually one of the reasons he is still very well respected within the reptile community. Over the past 15, 20 years, Tom has really made changes with the way he keeps his animals. He keeps a lot of his animals in very large outdoor enclosures. He became adamant about providing proper space. He's one of the very first people I heard talking about reptile intelligence and treating these animals with respect. I've even heard him talk about iguanas playing.
Roscoe, look at this. Oh my God. Oh my God. Toy play is imitating life activities, and he knows good and well what this is. Also notice he is outside in the yard, and he's not only not trying to run away, he wouldn't run away, and if I put him outside the fence, he'd go back home because he loves it here. How you treat them has everything to do with how they act.
Again, this is stuff that maybe now as science is developing and we're starting to understand the cognitive capacity of these animals is becoming more well known. But this is stuff Tom has been saying for literally decades. And in many ways, that's something that would be laughed at even 20 years ago, iguanas playing. But that is true. You know, he has this ability to provide proper enrichment for animals. And essentially at the end of the day, we're talking about someone who has a rough past, but seemingly has made some changes for the better. Tom's also been very outspoken about one of the practices that has been probably the biggest issue within our hobby in the last 20 years, and that is the mass production of animals in pursuit of interesting morphs. Morphs are different colors and patterns of the same species. So you could take something like a ball python, which is kind of a gold, brown, dark black kind of patterned small python species out of Africa. And over the years, these animals have been bred and crossbred and interbred and inbred to the point where they're finding these interesting different patterns and colors that can come out of it. It can be done ethically, but one of the biggest issues with it is A, you're dealing with lots of animals that are being overproduced, and B, we were left with these rack systems where animals are kept on top of each other in order to maximize space and efficiency.
Yeah. There's serious power from day one if you treat them in a humane way to begin with. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean keeping ball pythons in little pull-out boxes and giant retics and vision cages and all this other nonsense. It's really cruel and inhumane. All the puppy mill producing that's going on now, it's the same as puppy mills, except we're using reptiles instead of puppies.
Now, this practice has been very bad for the hobby. For anybody who's looking at reptile keeping from an external point of view, keeping animals in large rack systems and overproducing in order to try to find a cool color pattern is not a good look. Now, the ball python market has really taken a plunge over the past 10 years or so, especially in the last 5 years, I think. I want to show you a little video that I found on Brian Christie's YouTube page. Again, Brian Christie is the author of The Lizard King. He did a lot of research for his book, and some of it he actually posted on his YouTube channel. I highly recommend going to check it out. But take a look at this clip.
Genetic striped ball python.
Yep.
Oh, that's genetic.
Yes. This is simple recessive, striped. 25 grand right here. Boom. All day long.
So here's somebody back in the mid-2000s-ish looking at a genetic striped ball python, $25,000 all day. Let me show you where that price point is today for that exact morph. This is a genetic striped ball python on Morph Market right now for $100. What happened is basically what anybody would predict. The animals were overproduced, prices have plummeted, and now there are still some that have higher valued prices on them, but for the most part we have animals that are fairly inexpensive, and too many of them. There's over 50,000 of this one species of animal available on Morph Market right now, which is the largest kind of trade platform. And this is a practice that Tom spoke out against as well. So it really does leave me with the question, why would Tom participate in this docuseries? If you've watched Tiger King and you've watched Chimp Crazy, you know that the outcome of this documentary is not going to be, hey, reptile keeping is great for the community, let's keep it going. We know it's going to be the exact opposite. So why would somebody who clearly, although has a bit of a dark past, clearly has a passion for keeping reptiles and keeping pets and working with these species, why would he participate in something where he must know is going to do damage to the very thing he loves? I do have a theory on this, but we'll talk about that at the very end. Okay, so that covers Tom Crutchfield. Like I said, I absolutely believe he will be the main character in this Reptile King docuseries. That's why I had to spend so much time interlacing all these different stories that somehow all come back to Tom. Now, some of the other names that Chandler had mentioned in that clip of the Reptiles With podcast, one was Joe Wasilewski. I won't spend too much time on Joe because I just simply do not know a lot about him. Besides, he's a fairly well-respected conservationist, and he works for Croc Docs, which is a very well-respected crocodilian organization that's dedicated to crocodilian conservation and research. But while we're on the topic of Croc Docs, this is the point that I really want to strike home with this video, is that when you interlace Hollywood onto animal stories, things get carried away, lies get portrayed just for entertainment value. I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know. So one of the lead researchers at the Croc Docs is somebody named Dr. Sergio Balaguerra Renya. Sergio is a very well-respected researcher in the crocodilian space, and one of the things that he did in the last 5 or 6 years was rediscover a species of caiman, that's the yellow Aproporus caiman in the Amazon, after it had been basically gone missing from the scientific record for, I believe it's 80 years. I'm really straining my memory here. It's around 80 years since the last sighting had taken place. This was an animal that was not labeled extinct. It was just an animal that hadn't been seen in a very long time. Now, with his research, he and his team rediscovered the species and was able to put a scientific report to it. There's a great paper on it. I could put that in the show notes as well. But now things may be starting to become more familiar to you. Do you remember anybody finding or rediscovering a yellow Aproporus caiman in the recent Hollywood history? Well, I'm sure you've heard of the show Extinct or Alive by Forrest Gallant, and one of the episodes a few years ago was Forrest rediscovering, or I should say proving, that the yellow Aproporus caiman was not extinct. I want Sergio to tell this story quick.
Forrest just emailed us and tried to offer his help to do this expedition.
Is this before the first expedition?
This was before, yeah. So we started talking with him, email back and forth. But after a couple conversations, I just saw that so I told him, if you want to go, we are going to do research. You can film, but we are doing the research. So he said, yes, let's do that. I'm a biologist too, so we can do that. And we had a meeting, and I was open. I gave all the information. To get to this place, you need to take a flight from here to there. You guys can contact this company, and that company can help you out with arranging everything for your trip. After that, they just disappeared. We just, stopped talking. I went in December and I went back in January. And when I went back in January, the community told me that a crew from the States just came to that area and pay a lot of money to just go to the place and get some animals. I was talking with another journalist. He did a publication about, he was writing about parachute science. So all these guys that come from the first world and go to the third say that I want to help, and they just got the data and went out and published and say nothing about the people from the country. And I think that is the bad part here. No one owns species, so if you want to work with crocs, you can do it. But you need to give the rights and give the credits to the people that deserve it. It's impossible being from the middle of California knowing everything about how to go to the apoporis. Is that you got that knowledge from somewhere or somehow or someone. So I think that the point here is like we need to be ethical in the way that we work.
So essentially what you're dealing with is a production crew finding out information from the researcher who actually did the boots on the ground work and kind of taking the story for themselves. And Forrest actually did mention Sergio's name very briefly on one of his episodes that he did with Joe Rogan.
I've been following your exploits on social media, and the yellow caiman.
Yes.
Dude, that is a wild looking creature.
Isn't it? It's unbelievable.
It was thought to be extinct?
Yeah, so this it's a little confusing. It's a species that was last seen when the last one died in a zoo in the 80s. And because of the region that it occupies in Colombia, which has always been controlled by FARC rebels, nobody had been back down there to look for it. And myself and there's actually this amazing Colombian scientist named Sergio Riena, we're both kind of going and prodding and trying to see if we could get in. And we both found it within a month of each other.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Now, it was a beautiful looking
And
creature.
I mean, that has to be out of some sort of guilt about essentially taking credit for a researcher's work. Now, I know many people who know Forrest personally, and by all accounts, he is a fantastic person, super nice, fun to hang out with, and I don't doubt that for a second. He seems like a great guy, and I also don't think he is really intentionally participating in this. It's more like the producers of these shows kind of suck you into doing these bizarre things. It's a very similar story that I had when I had Paul Rosolie on, who's a very famous conservationist, Amazon conservationist as well. He talked about some of the experience he had when he did that kind of bizarre show for Amazon, Eaten Alive, where he was supposed to be eaten by an anaconda. The show itself was many ways, I think bizarre is the only word I can find to describe that show. I don't think it's certainly not about natural history. It's kind of just one of those shows that, again, if you're an animal person, you question why would anybody make this show. And from Paul's point of view, I think he thought that if he does this show, he could raise more money for conservation. In hindsight, he did not need to do that at all. He's done a lot more great conservation work since then. But I want you to hear a story about him talking to one of the producers on that show.
I mean, I sort of got, the kid in Hollywood. They flew me out to LA and I shook a bunch of hands and they said, look, let's, we film the show as you want it filmed. We make it about ecology and about the environment. We show your work. And then at the end, we'll just have this crazy stunt. And they were like, it's like hiding the broccoli under the, the meat and potatoes. They're like, they had all these like silly analogies and they're like, that'll get us the ratings. And then that's how you get people to hear your conservation message. And I was like, dude, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with that. We were like in the Amazon with a film crew, and we had things like we'd be on the ground, and I'd get like one of the like the DP would come up to me with like a sat phone, and I'd get on the phone and be like, "Who is this?" And they'd be like, "Well, don't worry about it. We're at Discovery Channel here." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And they'd be like, "We need you to get in a fight." This is a real conversation, everybody. He goes, "We need you to get in a fight with a bull shark for a commercial break." And I was like, "Excuse me." I was like, I just spent time getting research permits and we're like trying to like learn about how mercury relates to anacondas in the Amazonian ecosystem. And they were like, kid, listen, like bull shark, focus. And I was like, there aren't bull sharks in this part of the Amazon, and bull sharks in the Amazon are pretty rare. And where do you want me to find one? And how do you want me to fight it? And the guy was like, you're being very difficult. So he called back the next day and he goes, all right, well, since you were so difficult about the bull shark, we came up with this new plan where you guys are going to be riding on the river, and then Paul, don't worry. He said this. He goes, "Don't worry, you'll look like the hero." He goes, "You're going to be riding down the river, and all of a sudden you'll see that there's a lot of piranha ahead. So you'll pull the boat over, pour a bucket of blood into the river, and then go around the piranha." And I was like, "Sorry, but if we're in a boat, how would piranha possibly hurt us? Second of all, where would I get a bucket of blood? This idea doesn't make any sense." And so then I got the phone call from like the heavy suits where they were like, listen, kid, see, there's $3 million on the line and you got to have some results for us. We need something scary. And they were like, you're not scared enough in the jungle. And I was like, well, we're not scared here. I was like, this is where we work. And they were like, you're not getting it. We're going to pull the plug on the show. So we had to fake that there was an encounter with an electric eel. We basically found ourselves acting though. So it was like gun against your head. It was like, what do you do? It's like, well, do you still want some of the show? Do you still want some of the opportunity that's going to happen? And you go, well, fine, I'll make this one concession. Sure, this once. And then next week we're out there for 6 weeks. And so like, it would just be like thing after thing after thing where they'd be like, do this. No, do this. No. And then they'd be like, well, we'll pull the plug if you don't do this. And it's like, oh shit. That's
amazing.
It's crazy. And what you have is a bunch of dudes who've never left LA sitting there in like LA and DC, sort of like throwing back and forth like what they think would be like a cool idea, and then bouncing it off their superiors who are like 70 years old, sitting in an office somewhere, and then like they check that with the advertising. It's such a corporate thing.
So again, the thread through this video is that producers, people who are looking to create a story, will basically do anything to hold people's attention. And if it is wrestling a bull shark, or being eaten by a large snake, or pretending to find an animal that was never even listed as extinct, those sort of things will happen all the time. I don't expect anything different for this Reptile King docuseries. Tyler Nolan, that's another individual that Chandler mentioned in that clip. Now, Tyler is a Florida resident. He's somebody that's been a reptile keeper for a long time. If you were making a reptile show in Florida, you'd probably want to include Tyler in your show, but he's not somebody that necessarily the reptile community would want as a poster child. But if you were the person trying to produce an entertaining show, he's somebody that you're going to want to pick right away. He has a very popular YouTube channel. He was on Ink Master, so he's used to how TV is produced. But as far as somebody who's going to be out there in public showing people about reptiles, this is somebody who does a lot of fairly reckless free handling of his venomous snake collection. I think he would probably disagree with that, but many people, especially professionals in that industry, are not a fan of the way Tyler shows how he handles his snakes. He notoriously took a nearly fatal bite from a king cobra from Tom Crutchfield's house, one of Tom's snakes. And, just in general, this is not the person. If you ask the reptile community, who do you want to be our spokesperson, Tyler Nolan wouldn't be at the top of the list, and Tyler would probably admit that as well. But who knows the role he will have in this series. He's very close friends with Tom Crutchfield as well, so maybe he'll just play kind of a side role. Time will tell. So we've covered Tom Crutchfield, Jeff Leibowitz, Tyler Nolan. Dwayne Cunningham is another person that Chandler didn't mention, but I mentioned earlier, who I think will probably play a role in the show. The last one that I saw going around on Facebook, and this is especially making reptile keepers very nervous, is someone named Jeff Leibowitz. Now, Jeff is another venomous reptile keeper in the United States, and if you were to say that Tyler is a slightly reckless or irresponsible venomous snake free handler, I don't even think you could put Jeff on that scale, because he does stuff with his animals that is absolutely insane. He grabs them in weird ways, and his actions just recently were the cause of this insane meme. So this is somebody, by all accounts, is not a good person. I've heard many stories, again, allegations of him just harassing people and not being very nice, and even worse things than that I won't even get into because I don't know if they're true. But again, this is somebody who took a bite from a snake, made lots of news. The condition that the animals were in when the police, the wildlife enforcement agents went to his house were not good. Not the poster child we want in the reptile world, for sure. But he recently made a post about him doing a 2-part Netflix series, and he kind of made some sort of bragging about the money they were giving him. Now, personally, there's 2 things to consider here. First is that this series that Eric Goode is putting together is not necessarily going to be on Netflix. Tiger King was on Netflix. Chimp Crazy was on HBO. Eric is a very wealthy person. He doesn't need money from these large streaming sites to do it, so he's not going to be beholden to any of those. So who knows where the series will end up. So just because Jeff said he's going to be on Netflix does not mean he's going to be part of Eric Goode's Reptile King docuseries. The second thing is, if he claims to be part of a 2-part series, so he'll probably play a very small role. There's no way this entire Reptile King series is just going to be condensed down to 2 episodes. I'm sure it will be 6 or 8. So Jeff, if he is in it, has apparently maybe a 2-episode role. We'll see what happens. Who knows if he will be a part. There's no way that he could come off looking good in that show. I'm not exactly sure why he would want to participate in something. Well, I guess it's the money, right? He said it was the money. So clearly it's not going to make him look good. This is somebody who recklessly handled snakes, took a near fatal bite from his inland taipan, and had to beg people for anti-venom. Not the poster child we want. So hopefully up to this point, I've sort of sketched out the types of things you might see in this docuseries. If you are a reptile person, a reptile keeper, you're probably cringing. If you're not a reptile keeper and you just want to see some crazy things on TV, then you're probably looking forward to it. You may be somewhere in between. I think it's well known that after Tiger King came out, the Big Cat Public Safety Act was passed, and so this is actually bolted onto the Lacey Act that we talked about earlier, but this prohibits people from keeping big cats in captivity unless you're accredited zoo and whatnot, which meant all private ownership had to basically disappear. And we're seeing something very similar with the Captive Primate Safety Bill, which has not been passed yet, but it is something that I'm sure will be passed. Same sort of thing. It's going to prohibit the ownership of primates. Now, will we see something similar in the reptile world after this documentary gets put out? I should say the documentaries aren't necessarily the factor that brought these bills to the floor, but they're often the thing that pushes the public into thinking that keeping a tiger is not a good idea. So in all cases, the Public Safety Act, the Big Cat Act, and the Primate Act were already acts before these documentaries came out. It just gave them fuel for the fire. So will we see similar legislation that goes after reptile keepers after this docuseries comes out? Maybe. I think it's also clear for me to point out that I think that the Big Cat Safety Act and the Primate Act are actually good law. I think that's an important piece to make sure that people in the community are safe. Now, this is where I have to defend myself from sounding like a hypocrite. How can I say that the Big Cat Safety Act and the Primate Act are good, but now I'm saying, please don't come after the reptile keepers. We don't need that. Well, let me explain. Keeping large cats and keeping primates is a genuine danger to the public. Now, I'm sure there are people who did a great job privately with those either primates or tigers that were actually hurt by those bills. But in general, if you're keeping an animal like that, you are putting the public at danger. There's just no way around it. You're talking about apex predators or animals that just have absolutely insane strength. If they get out, it's a danger. Now, there are many reptiles that actually fit into that category as well. There's many large species of crocodilian or large constricting snakes or venomous animals that also pose a danger to the public, and I would actually be for regulating those in some way as well. But of course, my worry is that we're going to see a docuseries that shows all these crazy things, this illegal activity, animals that are dangerous, ending up in the communities, and that's going to be tied to somebody that keeps a leopard gecko at home. At the end of the day, the animals that we keep as pets or companions are all descendants of wild animals at some point down the line, and reptiles are really no different. When Tiger King came out and the Big Cat Safety Act was passed, nobody thought people shouldn't keep house cats. Even though house cats do a tremendous amount of damage on the environment, nobody went after the house cat people because Tiger King told them that tigers were dangerous. But I am worried that reptiles will be folded into the mix just as one lump sum because most people have no connection with those animals. They don't care about them at all. So we might as well throw them all in the same basket. Now, I want to end this video to show you, especially the non-reptile keeper, how positive reptile keeping can be and how beneficial it has been in the private sector. I can't speak for the public sector, but I want to share with you just a few short stories of how keeping reptiles has been a benefit to our culture and our society, and how I really hope, again, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater on this docuseries. So I'm just going to list through a few names here. The first one is Lori Tarini. Lori Tarini is a snake keeper out of the United States, and she wouldn't say this, but everybody else who knows her would. She's one of the world-leading experts in snake intelligence. There's just no other way to put it. She has been instrumental in understanding how snakes learn, how they can be conditioned, their cognitive abilities in general, and that has fully come out of the private sector. She now works with the university doing research all the time. I believe she's working on a master's right now as well. And again, this is totally out of the private sector. A massive amount of scientific literature will come out of this endeavor by Lori, and as a hobby, we couldn't be more proud of her. Is it going to be Reptile King interesting for a docuseries? No, because most people aren't interested in how snakes learn, but that's the point. I want to tell you that there are people doing really amazing things in our hobby that are not going to be portrayed in this series. The next person I want to mention is Dr. Zach Loafman. Dr. Loafman is a biologist in Virginia. I want to say he's a crayfish biologist, so that's his day job, but on his evenings and weekends, he's a reptile keeper and a reptile enthusiast. And last year, he wrote this book, The Natural History and Captive Care of False Water Cobras, Barren Racers, Musaranas, and Other Xenodontine Snakes. Now, there's an incredible amount of research in this book. If you were somebody that wanted to do some scientific research on these species and you didn't know anything about them, this would be a great place to start. So again, this is something that's purely come from the private sector that has added to our scientific literature. Now, how about conservation? I've talked to two different Nicks. One is Nick Stacy out of Texas, who works with Adelopus barbertonii, which is a type of toad and an Amazonian toad. He was the very first person to breed them in captivity, and he directly sends money from that project to their conservation in situ. The other Nick is Nick Gordon of the Abronia Alliance. He's working with preserving different species of Abronia. Again, these are animals that their wild population is being decimated in South America and Central America, and he's doing his best to preserve different species and make sure we have clean bloodlines of these animals so they do not get wiped off the face of the earth. I could literally continue to go on. There's Dr. Frances Baines out of the UK, who is a vet by training, but she's a reptile enthusiast and has done an incredible amount of work on understanding light and the importance of replicating sunlight for captive animals. And this is not something that's just for the reptile trade. It's something that's transcended into the zoological world, into the captive world. And zoos are constantly talking to reptile keepers about how to light their animals properly because it is such a vital importance when you're keeping reptiles. That's for another video. But there is so much intelligence and knowledge coming out of this space just due to keeping these animals in captivity that's helping all other animals that are in zoos and in other facilities. So again, my plea to the non-reptile keeper public after watching whatever happens with this documentary series about reptiles is that you take it with a grain of salt. Please know that what you see in that documentary is not an accurate depiction of what most people do. Most people who keep reptile pets are just, they got it for their birthday, they love their pet gecko, and they feed it and care for it every day. But there's a whole group of us who do take it to the next level and are focused on increasing the welfare of the animals that we keep, applying more enrichment, understanding what it means to care for an animal in the most ethical way to increase their welfare to the highest state. And I do believe that most sensible people can understand the difference between someone keeping a small ball python in their bedroom to somebody keeping an actual full-grown male chimpanzee in their garage. But I still think it is so important because of how these documentaries draw people in and convince people that this is the truth. And remember what I said at the beginning, Eric Goode isn't concerned about the truth as much as he's concerned about telling a story and making money. As he said, he wanted to make money to put it towards conservation. I can't hold that against him, but it needs to be clear that it's not necessarily going to be the truth. So it brings me all the way back to Tom Crutchfield. Why would Tom participate in a docuseries that he has to know is going to cause damage to the actual passion that he loves? Well, I recently saw that he has put up his house for sale and his farm for sale. He has a clip on Instagram talking about why that is. So there's maybe some mortgage and some banking things that are beyond my knowledge level. I don't know how all of that works. So maybe it's that. You know, it's also possible that he's going to make a lot of good money and he's planning on getting rid of things and just cashing out and being, enjoying the retired life and living off a nice check from Eric Goode. Who knows? I still have trouble reconciling that fact of he has to know that this documentary is not going to be super positive for us. But maybe there's a whole bunch of this documentary that's going to show how great reptile keeping is. I don't know. Anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. If you got to the end, I know this is quite a tale to weave through. Hopefully I did it okay and did some justice to it. Thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in learning more about reptile keeping and just how to care for animals ethically and responsibly, check out other shows, other episodes of the podcast. There's so many to go through at this point. I think there's over 220 episodes now, so you can really take your pick. Again, thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe if you're interested, and we'll catch you in the next video.